Hello, welcome everyone to Tofu Tech Talk. We have a brand new episode today live, and we have a fascinating and a very unique guest, very unique, which is MelissainDeNile, and I will give them the opportunity to introduce as much or as little as they like.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa in Denial. I am in denial in more ways than one. I am. I gotta do it. It's the slogan at this point. uh, I am an Egyptologist, archaeologist, museum educator, and educational content creator here on Twitch and on TikTok. I have my master's degree in Egyptian art and archaeology, and I have excavated at over 8 sites all over the world and worked in a couple different museums. And in my real time job, I work at a series of museums that have nothing to do with ancient Egypt, but luckily talk about archaeology. So I get to plug everything that I know like that. But otherwise, I teach people about ancient Egypt on Twitch through gaming. We play a lot of ancient Egypt, history, archaeology themed games, as well as doing guest lectures. So similar to Tofu Tech Talk, which I've realized like how similar this is. And I also give discussions. I do discussion lectures, and we're coming up on our 4-year stream anniversary. Um,
Oh,
yeah, and I'm special. We celebrate 2 anniversaries a year, one for the Melissa in Denial in September, and then one for streaming specifically here on Twitch in November. So,
ah,
coming up, we're going to do a 12-hour stream with lots of fun, different things to go on. Um,
no.
yeah, I'm so glad you guys invited me here. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, no, no. Thank you so much for coming on this. I really do appreciate it. And of course, it is going to be really cool and unique guests. Because, like I said, I mentioned to you before, my past guests have been usually STEM and social sciences, right? So yours kind of is going into that science direction, but you are still very unique in this, in the sense. Would it be fair to say that you're more of a historian in this case?
Yes, it's kind of funny how I would, yes, consider myself more of a historian than more on the STEM side,
Hmm.
but I've only probably taken one actual history course, like that has been labeled as like a history course. So I tend to say I'm an art historian and an archaeologist because my master's was specifically in art history. And it was an art history degree for Egyptian art and archaeology. And so
Mm.
my undergraduate was in archaeology and anthropology, so I've done a lot of excavating on that side. But then when it came to kind of my master's, it was much more art history and then as well as museum studies. And
Mm.
that's kind of where in between my master's program, I sort of realized, wait, maybe this is not exactly what I want to do. I don't want to go and do a PhD, which is kind of the typical track, to then become a professor and then kind of do all of that stuff. And I realized I would much rather do education. And so I'm happy that I got like the Egyptology background that I needed. I can
Mm.
read hieroglyphs very basically, but I can do it. And I'm happy with all that knowledge I got, but I probably should have done something more general, maybe museum studies.
Oh, like curation and something like that.
Yeah, probably more like museum. There's museum education, but it's a pretty rare major like in grad schools and
Hmm.
undergraduate, so technically you would go within like full museum studies, and then within that, instead of going to more to become a curator or become something else, you could do museum education, which is really what I like to do, and that's what I do in my real life. I am a museum educator at a series of museums, including an archaeology museum. So
That's
it's
really
very
awesome.
that's I gotten where I needed to be, but then it doesn't talk about Egyptology. Like this Melissa in Denial is a way for me to keep educated and to keep going within the field in just kind of my own way.
Perfect. So I suppose the question I have is, although it's in the name, what is an Egyptologist?
An Egyptologist has within all of archaeology, there is always a range of like what you do in archaeology. But
Hmm.
an Egyptologist is someone who specifically specifies in studying ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt goes anywhere from the pre-dynastic era and then roughly right after the Roman occupation of Egypt and like the death of Cleopatra the seventh. So
Mm.
the Cleopatra that everybody knows. And so there are some that study a little bit further into it, and they kind of are mixed with classicists because obviously the Romans overtake Egypt and they change everything.
Mm.
But within Egyptology, and this is the same thing with archaeology in general, is you can be on that more science side. You can be a bioarchaeologist that specializes in Egyptian mummies. You could be a curator who is working with Egyptian objects only at an Egyptian museum or a museum that has an Egyptian collection. Uh, you can be, I'm trying to think of like the more sciencey side of it. There are people who study like teeth, and they can go and figure out what those humans of the past ate, and tell you where they could have come from or what time period. Like there's so many different ways to get into archaeology and Egyptology specifically, because you kind of we need them. There are geo-Egyptologists or geo-archaeologists who study the rocks and the stones and how everything goes. And so there's tons of different ways to kind of get into it. And then there are the art historians who are deeply studying it, the art, and interpreting it. There's also linguistics, if you like linguistics, but you want to learn that. You could be an Egyptologist, you could be any other archaeologist, and it's just the joke that we have is that archaeologists tend to dig themselves into a hole, like a specialty hole, and then you dig yourself into another hole, and then another hole, and another hole. And truly it is hard to get out of that hole, because people know you by that specialty. And so it's always hard when people ask me what my specialty is, because I never did the PhD. So my specialty is a little bit more general than somebody who would have gone further and spent that possibly 6 years studying one particular topic to get a PhD.
No, that I like the digging a hole for themselves and staying in there in that little hole. That's really good. Sorry, you mentioned that ancient Egypt ranges from starting more recent history all the way from Cleopatra. What was the starting period that you mentioned? I'm not familiar with it. Sorry.
So generally we call it the pre-dynastic era. Yeah. So dynasty is essentially, the one thing that I always have to make clear to people is that the kingdoms and the time period parameters are not things that ancient Egyptians set upon themselves. It is something that modern Egyptologists have put upon themselves to make it easier for us to distinguish and understand.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So we call it the pre-dynastic age because it is before the dynasties that we have defined. And dynasties, in other scenarios, it's families who have ruled together, and then essentially like the dynasty will die off and another family will join.
Yeah.
Egypt, it's not like that. There are families. We do have families, and we do know some of them, like the Ramessides. They're all related. There's like 11 Ramesses. They're all related in some sense. But there are other scenarios where the dynasties are not related, and it's just a way that Egyptologists have grouped them over time. But then all of that time period is then grouped into kingdoms. So you have pre-dynastic Egypt, you have the first or early dynastic Egypt, which is a relatively new, which is crazy to say, but essentially very, very recently, Egyptologists have been like, this group needs to be separated from pre-dynastic, but it's not Old Kingdom. And so they've kind of separated them a little bit. Then there's Old Kingdom, First Intermediate Period, Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate Period, New Kingdom, Late Period, which in itself has a bajillion periods inside of it, Greek period, or Ptolemaic is the other word they use for it, and then Roman period. And that's like the very basics. But there's, I forgot Third Intermediate Period. There is a Third Intermediate Period between
an intermission between the periods.
yes, multiple different intermissions, and we're talking anywhere from pre-dynastic is hard to like hit down, because like it can go back down to like 5000 BCE. Because it's essentially these smaller nomadic groups that are living in Egypt at the time. But closer to 3000 BC is when we kind of consider the beginnings of the dynastic era. Sometimes to 3300 BCE is some of the first like pyramid builders, and starting to kind of, they've now taken all of Egypt and they've conquered all of it, so that it's all together in one section rather than being ruled by multiple people. Oh my God, I'm seeing so many good questions.
Don't worry, I'll ask them. I promise, I'll ask them.
Yes.
So I get, because I'm the Twitch streamer, I get asked all my questions. Yes. So Well,
Yeah.
I'll ask one more like proper on theme question, and then I have
Mm.
some fun stuff later. But and then we'll go through all of Twitch chat. But my question was, why Egypt? How like so you
Uh,
like history, right? I'm going to assume
mhm.
you
Yes.
were going
Yeah.
to school, you loved history as a subject, and you chose Egypt. Was it by any chance a movie franchise from the 90s?
So I feel everyone will be very disappointed. So I have been in love with Egypt since I was probably, and I believe, in first grade. So I was really, really young. And there was a book essentially that changed everything, and that is, if you, for Americans in the chat, it's called the Magic Treehouse series, and it's about these two siblings who would get into the treehouse in their backyard, and it would take them through time and space. And every book was different, and so you'd go somewhere completely different, and it could be in the future, it could be in the past. Most of it was in the past, and most of it had to do with some sort of really big historical event.
Mm.
And so the third book is called Mummies in the Morning, and they go into a pyramid. I do actually believe, reading it back as adult, I think a mummy does come alive, and that's a side note.
Oh.
But the other thing is that the author Mary Pope Osborne would write companion books that would have like just a nonfiction companion book
Mm-hmm.
about just that information. And so my mom bought it to me as a pair. And so I read that and I was like, oop, we're hooked. We're not going to get off of this anytime soon. And the other thing I was very grateful for was that because I liked it so much, my parents really encouraged me to learn more about it. And one of the things we did was, when the King Tut exhibit came to the United States in 2007, 2008, we went up to Philadelphia to go see it, and it made a whole like family vacation about
Oh.
it. And I, being the sassy, know-it-all, huge reader, I every time my parents would come up and say, "Did you know this, Melissa? Did you know this? Did you know this?" And I'd be like, "I already knew that all already." And I essentially ditched my parents, and I uh, skipped to the end of the exhibit because I thought the mask would be there. And I was like, "Well, that's the perfect place to put it. You got to put it at the end of the exhibit." And I was very disappointed to see it was not there
Oh.
because it does not leave Egypt. And I kind of made it a point that one day I will go, and I will go see the mask. And
Oh.
very happy to say, saw it last year on my first trip to
Aw.
Egypt, which
You have
was
photos of
uh,
it?
amazing. Oh yeah. Well, actually, you can't take photos of it because
Oh.
it's in like one of the specialty rooms. But
Oh.
when I was looking at it, and I was totally crying because I was very emotional, I suddenly saw that there was a slight sliver from the doorway where you could see it. And so when
Okay.
I went back out, I took some very illegal photos and videos of the mask through this tiny little slit in the doorway.
Mm, I see.
But yeah, it's ever since then, it truly, I didn't think would become a real like
Career,
career or
yeah.
anything like that. I really, kind of in the middle of like high school and stuff, I really just didn't think about it as much. I knew I loved history, and I
Mm,
loved ancient history in particular. Things that were like so thousands of years ago that you didn't have to, like, you just had to kind of figure it out.
mm,
And when I got to college, I went to college to be a creative writing major, and because I love writing books and fiction. And ironically, I told myself, hey, archaeology is going to be a good backup job. And if anybody knows how archaeology works, that's the biggest joke in the book, because archaeologists get paid nothing. And so as soon as I started taking classes, though, it flipped instantly. I was like, wait, what is this? What is archaeology? I've realized my entire life I have had the mindset of like an anthropologist, who,
mm,
somebody who doesn't judge other cultures for how they did things. And like I realized very quickly, I was like, wait, I've always thought like this, I just never had the words for this. And very quickly I was like, okay, how can I excavate as much things as possible? And unfortunately, I did not pick a good school for archaeology, so I had to find my own way. I ended up actually studying abroad in London for a semester to go to the Institute of Archaeology at UCL, and that
cool.
kind of changed everything. I was like, okay, I that was my first time I actually ever took an Egyptology class, which was amazing, and it was the first time I touched actual artifacts, because we had our classes in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. And so it was like game
Something out of
changer.
a
I was like,
game or a
okay,
movie.
yeah. I was like, this is the life-changing moment. This is where we're going to go
Mm.
from here.
Oh,
Um, so it's
fantastic.
always been Egypt, but I do love all history, and it's very hard for me to like, it's very hard for me to be in that hole where I'm like, people always ask me on TikTok or something, like, hey, did you see this news about Pompeii? Or did you hear this news about Petra? And I'm like, I want to talk about it, but I don't have the background knowledge. So I don't always feel comfortable to kind of
Mm.
talk about that as much as like I really would love to talk about all archaeology, but anxiety. I need the background knowledge that I would not have if I talked about anything other than Egypt.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful, detailed answer, and I'm just so glad that you had such a wonderful adventure with Egyptology and how you got to the point that you are
Yeah.
today, starting from childhood. I'm going to ignore Spooky's joke about the pyramids not fitting in the British Museum because that's not a serious question. It never is. Spooky. You'll get used to Spooky in the. Has Melissa ever found anything from a site? And what
Mm.
conservation steps are needed, humidity, etc. So I know you were saying that this
Oh
is
yeah.
not something that you are an expert in the field specifically, but do you have general
No.
commentary on this?
Yes, I do. So I have worked on or I've been on 8 separate archaeological digs, a few of them at the same exact location, and I found plenty of things. I actually am about to post a video probably in the next few days on TikTok about my favorite artifacts that I've ever found. And it just
Ooh.
depends on the object. So things that are made out of stone or things that are made out of like stone, yeah, stone statues, stone things, like they don't need much conservation unless they need to be repaired, and that's a separate version of
Mm-hmm.
conservation. But you always want mid humidity. You don't want it to be too cold, you don't want it to be too hot, and you don't want it to be too humid. I believe the woman the our collections person at work is about, I think she's like about 45% humidity or something like that.
Okay.
Something close to that is kind of the standard. But it does depend on the object. So any sort of organic material, which are rarely found outside of places like Egypt. Organic material like wood, like humans are organic material, like any sort of human remains. Bone in general is actually pretty okay. Like it definitely can get, but more of so the organic material, paper, cloth, those things need a lot of conservation, need a lot of things to be able to um, uh, be good. Wood, especially, if you find it in a it can only be very dry or
Okay.
very wet.
The
So
extremes.
Egypt has the very dry. So that needs to have a very low humidity. It needs to be continuously done that. But if you find things that are very wet, like sunken ships, sunken ship beams, those either need to stay in water until they've been conserved, or you actually have to do a process where you remove the water and replace it with something called, in this case, oh my gosh, what's it called? It's pyroglycinate, something like that. I
Okay.
can't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's semi a resin. It's not totally a resin, but it's
Yes.
similar. Where it looks like water. It's very fluid, but it will not evaporate. And so you have to then insert that in and replace all the water in the wood, and then freeze dry it. And that's the biggest standard with conservation, though, is everything needs to be reversible. It sounds counterintuitive. It does, but everything with conservation of art and artifacts needs to be reversible so that in the future, if you find something better to change it, you can undo what you previously did and redo it. So you're not damaging it, pretty
Wow.
much. So conservation is a deep science that I only know the very surface level of stuff.
Mm.
And you don't have to be a specialist in anything pretty much to be like you have to go to conservation school and do all that, but you can then work on any object that you are qualified to work
Mm.
on pretty much. You don't need to be an Egyptologist or any sort of
Yeah.
specialty. It's
No,
not going to
absolutely.
really
I
affect
know
your
that
work that much.
so many frescoes and things like that there are actually hired artists to constantly conserve it and to keep the
Yeah,
color alive, and
absolutely.
this is done every few years. There is a whole
Egypt
working.
has a pretty good program where they are training local Egyptians in conservation.
Oh.
And so a lot of times you'll see and conservation of like big temples is slightly different. They actually use lasers to laser off the soot, because a lot of the temples, both the temples and the tombs, either when they were used as a temple or a tomb, or when they were used as possibly a random living situation in that in between time, were used with fire, and like they had torches, and that made the
Okay.
entire ceilings covered in soot. And so they've been doing a lot of work. Temple of Dendera, they've did work in Temple of Esna, where they are lasering off the soot to then reveal the color that was underneath. And then maybe doing a little conservation work to keep the color, but mostly it's just
Did the
taking the soot
soot actually
off.
conserve it as well? I wonder, to a certain
In a
degree.
way, yeah, it
Oh,
definitely
cool.
helps. It definitely helped it in a way. I haven't heard a lot about where you have to do a lot of extra, like filling in the
Hmm.
colors of other places. There's the Temple of Dendera, which I was able to go see. They had just redid the entire ceiling, and they actually left one big square to show the difference between what the soot was and what it was. And it's night and day. It's literally a black square. You could not see any color, any of the design underneath, and the ceiling was just like absolutely pristine. Looked like it probably had been painted yesterday.
That's amazing. That's nice. And I like the idea that you were saying that that uh there are training programs in place,
Mhm.
which I think is fantastic. Although this might be a joke, Indiana asks, how many booby traps have you come across in the pyramids?
Ah,
Have you actually ever come across a booby trap, as
no,
according to lore
no.
and movies? No.
I actually just did. I just do a video about this? I think I did. I just did a video about this. There are no real booby traps, at least in Egyptian pyramids or in Egyptian tombs. There are things that I will classify as tricks. And those are essentially for the same reason. They are things that the ancient Egyptian architects have done to try to stop looters into their pyramids.
Like
Um,
mazes?
Mazes, yeah, in some cases, yeah, lots of turning passages, but the two main ones for inside of pyramids, in some of which the pyramids of Giza did not have this. This is later Middle Kingdom pyramids, which are not preserved well at all. They would sometimes the actual passageway that would lead to like the burial chamber, they would put in a stone so that it really you would not be able to see and you would not be able to know that's where the passage was. And then down that hallway they would make a half passage and they would fill it with rubble to kind of give it the sense that, oh, that's probably where we should go because hey, they didn't finish it. And that they should go and try to use that way, and then the actual
Hmm.
passageway is perfectly hidden. In the same case, in tombs in the Valley of the Kings, there's something called a well shaft, and a well shaft is a deep shaft at one point, kind of later in the tomb typically, and there was a doorway to go to the actual burial chamber on the other side of it, but they would plaster and paint over it. And so essentially it would look like a tomb looter is coming down the stairs and he goes, whoa, it just goes straight down. I guess we have to get down there to get it. But the key thing that people don't know about tomb looting is the vast majority of tombs and pyramids and places in Egypt were looted by people at least a couple months to a couple years after they were built. And that is
That's
because they were looted by the people who built them. And we know this. They were looted by the people who built them, and so guess what? If you built that tomb, and you get down to the well shaft and you say, "Well, there's a hidden door over there. We just need to break it open," because the people who typically wanted to loot it and wanted to take it are the people who were building it, and
mm.
so very rarely. Like we do have obviously looting in later times, but the vast majority of stuff is taken within a couple years of them
Oh.
actually being built and
Mm.
finished. So unfortunately, no matter what, those tricks are not really going to work for those people. So most of the
Yeah.
time, they don't really work out that way.
Oh, so much
But yeah, no
information
swinging
lost.
balls, no
No
spears,
arrows.
no arrows, no nothing like that.
um, a question about your opinion, please, on the age of the pyramids. Someone's saying that they think it's
Ah,
10,000 years, which is older than the common consensus. What is the common consensus at the moment for pyramids?
the common consensus is that it is in the. I'm quickly looking at my cheat
Yeah.
sheet. It is around 2500 BCE.
Okay.
There, I have found no evidence that it is older than that. A lot of those, unfortunately, fall into the conspiracy theorists who are going with aliens built it, or unfortunately, a lot of these conspiracy theories are deeply, deeply rooted in racism
Oh
against Native
shit.
Egyptians, against
Sorry.
modern Egyptians. Yeah.
Slipped. I was like, that was so
No, it's
random.
no, it is unfortunately. The Some of the earliest Egyptologists theorized that the people who actually built the pyramids were not Native Egyptians, and they were actually a European group who invaded and then built those. And all of these conspiracy theories all semi trace back to some of those early theories. And so they are deeply rooted in racism, where they don't think that an African nation could build something
Mm,
impressive. And so yes, so the dates of the pyramids are, it's definitely a little bit rough because we don't have a lot of written records from the Old Kingdom, but they are definitely in like the 2500 BC, around that era. The other thing, which I also am about to post a video about, is about the Sphinx itself, where people say the Sphinx is 10,000 years old or older.
mm,
And that, in that case, it is older by one sense, in that it is actually made out of a natural rock outcropping. So yes, the stone that made the Sphinx is probably 10,000 years old or something. But then it was carved and built around the same time as the
mm.
pyramids. Though
Okay.
there are back and forth theories if they were built by Khufu or Khafre, but their son and their father and son, so it's
Mm.
not it's not that far off, just a couple years.
Okay. That's really interesting. I was thinking you're going to go down the conspiracy theory of aliens, which is always great. You know, we love to talk about
It
aliens and
it's it
yeah.
it still does come up. It does still come up, of course. But yeah, there's not a lot of good evidence that has come up about it. A lot of it is people who conspiracy theorists who never tend to focus on one particular nation or one particular civilization, and just sort of jump around between what is the most popular thing to kind of talk about at the time.
Mm,
And I hate to say it, I don't really trust those people because they have not spent the amount of years that an actual Egyptologist has studied
mm.
and worked on a particular site. They are literally only coming from, like, they're in some cases they're like armchair archaeologists, people who sit in their chair and they do all their research on their computer and
Mm.
don't actually go to the site and see it.
And just on Deanna's follow up on that, did the Goa'uld build the pyramids? I don't know if you watched Stargate. Have you?
Oh god, this is another thing. I've watched the movie. I have not watched
Okay.
this TV series.
Okay.
Though I
Fair
have
enough.
very actual high opinions about the movies, but no. I no.
Okay. Oh, we're getting so many questions. You are a very popular guest. Brace yourself because we're taking you all over Egypt through different
I'm
timelines
ready.
here.
I'm ready.
So Orph is asking, I wonder why Egyptology is so popular, and it's true because I
Mm,
know, like growing up, it was a popular topic. Like
yeah.
all of us were always interested in it. Is it more because of it being a great ancient civilization, more of the original obsession of English with Egyptian culture, or the fact that we're able to decode their writing? Or maybe it's just popular in pulp culture, but not really more common than Roman culture dedicated historians, or say Native American space specializations, etc. So, broad question, but loads.
Almost all of those things are correct. Absolutely. It
Mm.
definitely has to stem down to, if we look at like the past, we call it Egyptomania. Egyptomania exists, and there are other manias. There are other times where certain other cultures become fascinated with another one. But Egyptomania is very, very old in comparison. It dates all the way back to the 1790s with the Napoleonic campaign to Egypt, which
Yes.
essentially opened up the country to Europe and to other places around the world. And I think a lot of the fascination goes with, it still took them about, let me think, about like 50 years after that for them to actually translate hieroglyphs. So there was this hype where it's like, there's this strange language. What does it mean? And like everyone trying to fight over taking things to put in museums and to expand it. And so Egyptomania has always been a thing, and there are always waves of it. It definitely went down a little bit after then, and we had lots of Egyptologists and early archaeologists coming to Egypt. But then it really ramped up again with the tomb of Tutankhamun being discovered in the early
Oh,
1900s. And
yes.
that was a really big time because that was around the time where media obviously was not like it is now, but it was heavily expanding. Um, and my hysterical joke about uh mummies curses, which is one of the specialty topics I've talked about a lot, is that it really all mummy curses, all of the really old original mummies curses have all stemmed back to British media, which is so funny to me because of how like the British media is portrayed now and like how it works and how it does it because I can't even believe how like when I did all this tracing and going back and forth, the entire concept of a mummy's curse comes from British media, trying to scare people and trying to freak people out. And it really cracked me up because I was like, wait, this is so weird that these three main stories, two of them being earlier than Tutankhamun, but
Mm.
then later people think Tutankhamun's the first one. It is by far not. But they all stem from early British media and newspapers and how people were getting information at the time.
Okay.
Um, in a modern sense, I think people are just, at least in my case, I always was attracted to the things that were so different than my own world. And there are so many different cultures that are, but Egypt is kind of the most prominent facing one. But I do find it so unfortunate because there are so many great other ancient cultures that are never focused on.
Mm.
Um, the At least in American school system, in 3rd grade, when I was a kid, you learned about ancient Egypt, you learned about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and I can't remember, there was one other one we learned. Nowadays, you actually learn about ancient China, in
Oh,
some cases,
wow.
ancient India, and in some cases, ancient Africa, like Southern Africa. I think actually it was I probably learned about Mesoamerica and like Incans and Mayans and stuff.
Mm.
Um, but that was like 3rd grade was like that was a huge stem for me. But it's Egypt is always there on that forefront. There are
Mm.
so many other smaller ancient cultures that did not last as long as Egypt did, that always makes me sad that nobody really studies them, that it becomes such a specialty topic that I'm like, but it is as big as classicists. There are so many more classicists in the world who study
Oh,
Greece and Rome,
yeah.
um, because they branch between historians, art historians, archaeologists, linguistics, literature. Um, but I think Egypt just always, out of all of those, is so different from our own. And so people are always really attracted to it and they're trying to figure out why would they would do this. And
Mm.
I also find it's because of that clickbaity title that also
Mhm.
always usually comes up. Like Egypt did this, Egypt did that. And it's just like
Mm.
things like that always seem to like pull people in and attract people.
Something they mentioned there, I don't know if this is on the line of thought, but another thing is that
Yeah.
you mentioned that there's so much more classicists out there,
Mhm.
right? And we had like a revitalization of it with the Renaissance and things like that
Yeah.
in Europe. So I wonder, is it because when the fall of ancient Egypt happened, it never had its, reboot movie, if that makes sense, or it
Mhm.
never had that comeback in any way, and so it really is an
No,
isolated um culture,
it is.
and it was so well preserved in so many ways as
Yeah.
well, so it's so
I
fascinating.
think the preservation is a huge thing. Is
Mm,
that because of the weather and because of the just natural environment, so many more things are preserved than in other cases. And there are so many classicists and there are so many people who research that. Um, but Egypt just always is just a little bit different. And even when Egypt kind of fell to the Romans, a lot of Roman like culture was talking about how Egypt was weird and they kind of shut it all down. And then
mm,
eventually it gets conquered by the Arabs. And the Arabic culture is you really are not supposed to worship any other gods or do anything like that. And so they kept it very hush hush. They didn't talk about it a lot. They didn't really acknowledge a lot of these big monuments that were there or the things that they might
mm,
have been finding. And so it really is like it was opened up in the 1790s. Like when
mm,
it that no one had really heard about it before. It was not something that had been studied truly. Like there were a few people who like religious people or priests that would go and take like cruises down the Nile and they would just occasionally record things. And we even have Greek and Roman people like Herodotus and Plato and things like that who
Mm.
visited Egypt and wrote stuff. But there is
Oh.
this very large gap in between that and the 1790s where people just didn't really acknowledge Egypt at
Yeah.
all. And I think that is probably why it's something that people nowadays are just like,
Mm.
whoa, whoa, what is this? And there are certain pockets of time that Egyptologists, even within the field, study more often than not, because it's like, I call it the gateway. It's the gateway drug to get you into Egyptology. And some people will always stick with that, and that will be their specialty, and some people will expand onto it.
Mm.
But it's Tutankhamun is a huge one. The
Mm.
pyramids are another really big one. And even another period just before Tutankhamun is the Amarna period, which is my personal gateway drug that I really haven't really left it at all. But that
Mm.
is a time period that brings people in even more, and often people either stick with it or they decide they're going to be a full Egyptologist and expand and learn more. But there are the cultures that people just we talk about constantly, constantly, constantly.
Mm.
Nobody ever talks about the late period. Nobody ever talks about the intermediate periods. Like it is the same periods over and over again. It's the same pharaohs that get talked about over and over again. That
For all the
I literally had
excitement.
to make a video about how did you know that before uh, Djoser, who builds the Step Pyramid, who's just a couple pharaohs ahead of all the pyramids of Giza pharaohs, there are over 50 suspected pharaohs. Nobody ever talks about them. Like, nobody does. And it's because we don't know a lot. Like, it's so early, we don't know a lot, but nobody ever talks about them. You will never hear their names when you go, if you're a tourist in Egypt or you go to an Egyptian museum. You'll never hear about them. You just won't.
No, that's so cool. Oh, geez, there's so much. I guess like that's the thing. There's so much with you.
There's
Yeah,
so much.
someone had said, "Oh, there's a lot of questions." Hell yeah, there's a lot. I hope you booked another hour off for this. Mm,
I can say as long as you want. I got the
love
day
it.
off. I'm not going anywhere.
Get Good asks, how accurate are the dating methods used to determine the age of a statue or an
Mm.
artifact? So, because I only learned about the radiocarbon dating method. So again, this is we mentioned earlier that you don't do too many, but you did do a little bit. So this
A
is
little
still.
bit.
Mm,
Archaeology is all about context. And so yes, we can do radiocarbon dating, but you can't do that on every single type of
mm,
material. I'm not even clear which ones. I know you can do it with a lot of organic material. I don't think you can do it with stone. I think you can do it with bone. There's like only a select amount of materials that you can use radiocarbon dating for.
mm.
But everything else is based on context. So this is something that I actually do like in my daily life for archaeology. So I'm trying to think of like things that I can pull. Essentially, it's like if you find this yellow pen
Mm-hmm.
and you know that you're in a building and you find it over here, then you also find a binder clip and you also find a keyboard or you find something else. Somebody might say you're in an office of a house. You might be in an office of a building, but you might be in an office of a house because of if over here, if you find something, you find a faucet, you find a toothbrush, you find a cap to something, you might be in the bathroom. But if you mix all those artifacts together, you're not going to be able to tell. You might be able to say you're in a house, but you also could be in a building because a building was also going to have a bathroom, an office
Mm.
building, a retail building. And so it's all about context and finding things in the same exact place. And you can also do this with dating. Certain objects in the past, archaeologists have written long, long papers where they have said, okay, these we can securely give a date. We know exactly when, and with Egyptology, it's never perfectly exact, but at least a very large span of it. And you say we know when this type of pottery was made, so anything around it and in the same like layer, literally like the depth, you can assume that everything in that layer is going to be at least from that time period or earlier
Mm.
because it can't be later. It's the same thing if you find like a penny and a penny says it was made in 1975. Anything around that cannot be made in 1976. It has to be made in 1975 or earlier.
Mm.
Um, and so that can help us with dating. That is so much more that is so much easier to do with like much more modern archaeology. Like the archaeology that I work is all like colonial America and on in my full-time job, and that is so much easier because we know exactly when this type of pottery was made because we know from the actual potter we have the records when his pottery
Yeah.
studio was open. So Egypt, it's never super, super exact, but it can get pretty close. Um, the big thing that we help with Egypt is that if we have something that has the name of a pharaoh, and
Mm.
those dates have typically been established or at least within a couple years. And so finding something like that, like trying to find something that oh, like finding like this is obviously a
Ooh.
massive version of a scarab, but finding something with the text on the back, and if it had a cartouche, which is it's a long line that surrounds the name of a pharaoh. If it has that cartouche, then I find this along with all this other type of pottery and all this other architectural material. I say, well, it has to be at least from when this guy was ruling.
Or
And in
onwards.
some cases, yeah, or earlier. It can't be
Oh,
later, but it
sorry.
can be
Got
yes.
my timelines mixed up.
Yeah, so it can't be later, but also different pharaohs have different names at different times, or they change how they've talked about them, or they'll include the names of their children, and we know roughly when the so like this is a very
Mm.
long way to say like yes, there is the science version of dating, but then it also is very much based on the context and the artifacts
Yeah.
found. Um, and
Mm.
in some cases there are written records, but that's really rare.
Yeah. Fantastic. Oh, these are fantastic answers to the
Oh,
questions.
actually, the one quick thing,
Yeah.
one of the greatest ways to do it is that sometimes pieces of pottery will have a label on the pottery. So, like a wine jug will have a label written on the piece of
Yeah.
pottery, and it will say, "This wine was made in year 5 of this guy's reign." And so that
Perfect.
literally is like perfect. Great. We just have to find out when the guy's reign was, but we literally know almost to the year when that
Yeah.
wine was made, and that will help the context of that. It is. It's literally a best use before date. It is.
Best use
Truly.
before date.
Yes, it
um,
actually is.
Whisper asks, it may be a controversial question. I don't understand this question, so if it's uncomfortable, let me know. Is there any evidence for Exodus and other biblical studies in ancient Egypt?
So I will give a trigger warning if anybody does not want to listen to it. You can say this. I was raised religious, but I am no longer. If you are very religious and you do not want to hear this answer,
Okay.
then pause it for a brief second. Because I've talked about this before, and it
Okay.
is very hard to say this answer because I don't want to offend anybody and I don't want to like ruin anybody's religious beliefs. Okay, if you've left, there is no archaeological evidence of a lot of the things that happen in the Bible. Exodus is a little bit. I haven't had that specific question
Yeah.
often. It's more often the things that are happening in uh, the time of Joseph and the time of Moses. A
Hmm.
lot of that stuff. We do not have any archaeological evidence that there was a large enslaved group living in Egypt, let alone a large enslaved Jewish or Canaanite origin. And so biblical archaeologists are a thing, but they are a completely different side of it. And often or not, I don't see them in Egypt. They are really not uh, focused on Egypt. They are much more focused with the Holy Land and with places in the
Okay.
Levant or Israel, Palestine, all of
Mm.
those areas. I don't often see them kind of bridging the gap over to Egypt because Egypt is not mentioned that often in the Bible.
Okay.
There are theorists who have kind of pinpointed a time, and sometimes because the pharaohs are not named in the
Yeah.
Bible, they're just said as the
Okay.
pharaoh. Um, this was my unfortunate discovery when I was in undergraduate and I was like trying to pick a senior thesis topic, and I was like, well, why don't I look at what the pharaohs' names are in the Bible? And then I stumbled upon this and I went, oh my God, my entire childhood is a lie. And that was really genuinely, even though I had not been religious for many years at that point, it was really hard to stomach. I was like,
Mm.
"Oh my gosh, I cannot believe this." So yeah, that's the best that I can say. If you can look into more of like biblical archaeologists and like what they are researching, but when it comes to Egypt, there's not
Yeah.
much.
I'm going to skip Orf's question about bondage just because it's slightly humorous and I want to stay on topic. We have too many questions. This is
Too many
shocking.
questions.
Yes, usually I get, yeah. Have we explored every passage inside the Great Pyramids with remote control
Yes.
cameras and such? Whisper asks as well.
Yes, we have, although the what do they call them? The air shaft passages which connect to the king's chamber, they have put little robots in there to try to get in, and they are blocked in multiple
Locked?
spots. So they can, yes. There are points where they've reached it, and you can watch video. You can see videos online of
Mm-hmm.
what they discovered, and they are blocked in random parts. And the understanding of those, like, they are probably air shafts, but there might also be a more religious aspect of a way
Mm.
that the soul can get into to visit the body, because parts of the Egyptian soul would fly and would leave and then would come back. So there's a lot of interesting things there. If you saw the news, when was that? That was probably 2 years ago. They did discover another chamber. It's not a passage, it's a chamber because it's just one room. They did discover another chamber in the Great Pyramid, via a small camera. I don't think I haven't heard anything about if they're going to try to get in there. They should not, because it is technically a uh what is it? It's technically an architectural term for a empty passage to support the weight of all the massive stones on top of it.
Yeah.
So I really hope, and I kind of know enough about how the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities like works. They are not just going to carve a giant person-sized hole to like get in
Mm.
there. So I don't think anything will happen of it, but I know that they are probably still investigating it and seeing what else they can discover inside that chamber.
Mm. Okay, thank you so much for that. Also, how did they prevent smoke stains from torches when painting inside the tombs? So that was really, that
Oh,
was from half an hour ago when we were
I have
talking
no
about that.
idea. Yes. I have no idea. That is such a good. Oh my god, I have no idea. I didn't even think about
Well
that.
done, Whisper. You've stumped the
Well
guest.
done, Whisper. That is, yeah, I don't know how they would have. Well, I think mostly because the soot piles up after hundreds and hundreds of years. So
Mm.
I don't think it would pile up that quickly, but you are right. Like, yeah, they would have paint and wet things. So I don't know. That is a very good question. I mean, they would have to use torchlight. There's no other option. So that's such a good question. I've never thought about that before.
Another rabbit hole there to unlock.
Yeah, another rabbit hole for me to go down one day.
Do you know of any tools or technologies of ancient Egypt that were either rediscovered through archaeology or yet to be figured out? If so, what is the most
Mm,
interesting among them?
Probably one of the most interesting ones is their use of copper tools, because copper is real weak. And so this unfortunately has been where a lot of the pyramid idiots really go on with how the pyramid was built. And they're like, they had copper tools, they couldn't use it. There was a recent study of the area outside of the Giza pyramids where a geochemist and a geoarchaeologist dug down deeper to see if there was any sort of metallic um, pollution in the soil, back to the time that would kind of be closer to the pyramids. And they ended up finding an insane amount of copper pollution, showing that a lot of copper had been processed through to make tools and to use in other scenarios. But then that's when I discovered that copper for ancient Egyptians usually had some sort of arsenic added into it so that it would be stronger. Um,
Hmm.
and so a lot of the copper tools is what was used, copper chisels, copper saws, to take down a lot of the stone, but along with using sand and grinding. But that was a recent thing for me, because I'm not very well versed on architectural, like how they built the pyramids and some of the
Yeah.
different theories and tools. But there are a lot of things that we have found, a lot of different tools. Hammers are really cool because they're typically made out of wood, and they're huge. They're like this giant big block. But over time, they will be almost look like closer to like Thor's hammer. They will have these big indents
Ah.
where they have been constantly hammering over and over
Yeah.
again. And so you can see, oh, this is a used hammer. This is like definitely somebody used this for a really
Yeah.
long time. And those are my favorite artifacts, things that ancient Egyptian quote unquote art is not art. It is
Mm,
not the same thing as a medieval Renaissance painting that I'm going to hang up on the wall so
yeah.
that I can use it for primarily aesthetic purposes. All ancient Egyptian artifacts are functional pieces, even if they are pretty, even if that function is to be beautiful. They are all functional pieces. And that's why I love that. And it's the same thing with other ancient cultures, but ancient Egyptians in particular, everything had a function. No matter what it was, everything had a function in some sort of way because everything had a meaning for the
Mm.
ancient Egyptians. So much deeper meaning than me just having this yellow pen. Like everything had a meaning behind it.
That's very good. The copper tools. I suppose to jump on this, there have been theories, and I've been
Mhm.
attacked before online because I talk about batteries all the time, and I talk about the first battery. I don't know if you
Ah,
heard that
the
supposedly
Baghdad battery.
not even the Baghdad battery.
Not the Baghdad one. Oh,
Well, the
okay.
Baghdad one. So my general commentary on that is the arc. From what I understand from the archaeology community, is that
Hmm.
there isn't sufficient proof of it, and it is not
Yeah.
accepted. But before even the Baghdad battery, a lot of the deposition of the pharaohs, because you know that their tombs have loads of beautiful golden plating and all of this,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
supposedly a lot of people are proposing that they had electrodeposition
Mm.
possibilities, which I looked into it. It doesn't seem like it's supported. Is that true? What is the
No.
lore at the moment? No, they're not supporting
Oh,
that they had
the current
electricity.
yeah, the current lore is that the pyramids are giant uh batteries or giant electronic plants. Yeah, but it's not even I don't even say it's not even lore. It's just like people saying shit.
Mm,
Like it's not even like there's so much like I will say there is one pyramid, not the pyramids of Giza. There is another pyramid that along with being a pyramid and being a pyramid is a tomb. That
mm,
is what it was used for. It is used as a cult center to worship the deceased pharaoh after he has died, somewhere where uh, he is now a god, pretty much. There is a pyramid south near the Fayum Oasis, which there is a theory that, along with it being a pyramid, it was also some sort of water hydration plant that,
mm.
sorry, not a plant,
Like a hydropower plant?
uh, not a hydropower plant. I'm forgetting my words. Somewhere where it could collect water,
Okay.
collect rainwater, and it would run down the pyramid, and there
Hydro
was a
station?
pool, and
Yeah, yeah, okay. That's a
I,
word.
I
That's a
I'm
hard
blanking on
word
the
to think, actually.
yeah, I'm blanking on the specific word and stuff, but yes, there is like that is the only one that I have seen that has had any other function than it just being a cult center
Mm,
and a burial place.
okay.
But yeah, I realize I just on my TikTok, I do not talk about the pyramids enough because I posted the video about the copper pollution and oh my God, the people came out in the comments and it's insanity. I realize I'm like, I am much more a new kingdom person. That is like the time period that I like more often than the old kingdom. But woo, oh my God, the comments of battery plants
Yeah.
and just so much
I
copper wiring. And I'm like,
my shock. I was talking about physics and chemistry, and then I posted about the story of Volta's battery, and I got attacked by supposed Egyptologists saying that there were batteries in ancient Egypt.
yeah, those are not Egyptologists. Those are either people just truly there to mess you up and just try to get you to be crazy, or there are people who just believe that. And I just like I hate to say it, if there were batteries, if there was electricity, it would be over every single Egyptian tomb wall. The Egyptians would have recorded that forever.
Mm,
Like literally everywhere it would be because the Egyptians everything they recorded their entire lives on tombs and temple walls. And yes, I will admit there is one that does look like a giant light bulb. It's not a light bulb. It's a lotus flower because it has a snake in the middle of it. And yes, there also is one that looks like a flying car. It's not a flying car. It's that they overlaid two versions of hieroglyphs and the plaster pieces have fallen out. And yes, I do admit it looks like a flying car, but it's not a
mm.
flying car, people. I have seen those in person. I went to both of those temples and saw them. And I know they look like that. But if you read the hieroglyphs around it, why would they not have a word for light bulb? Why would
Yeah.
they not have a word for flying car? Like they don't. They don't. That's just not how this
My
works.
community are very disappointed right now. They are
I'm
hard
so
start. Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. You just broke too many hearts here. I'm so sorry.
There's yeah, Roy, there is one that looks like a flying car and there's one that looks like a helicopter. And I know it does look like a helicopter, but it's not a helicopter. It's just so funny to me because truly it's like people will find one smidgen of evidence
Mm,
and they will say that this is how it was in all of ancient Egypt. And
mm,
I'm like, no, that's not how it works. It has to like it's just they focus on that
mm.
and
Yeah.
Big Eve to say as a cover up, excuse me. I am
Man,
not paid by the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Absolutely not. I wish they would pay me to do
before
something.
too many people leave this community because of broken hearts about all the conspiracy theories going out the window. Who is your favorite pharaoh? Asks Silver Sunset,
Oh.
and why?
Hello, Silver. Silver Sunset is a lovely Egypt maniac like me. My favorite pharaoh. Oh, it's so hard. It's probably Amenhotep III or Akhenaten, and Akhenaten will usually always be the first one. Amenhotep III is the grandfather of Tutankhamun. He just seemed really chill. He seemed really cool. He had giant scarabs like this that would kind of announce different things that he would kind of spread around Egypt. And it was a relatively like a time of like a lot of prosperous like not really wars, not really like invading, but like the country was like really good at that time. But then there's Akhenaten, and I just love Akhenaten. He is Amenhotep III's son, originally born as Amenhotep IV, and he changes everything. He decides, hey, we're not going to worship multiple gods. We're just going to worship one god as like the head god. And we're going to move the entire capital to somewhere that has never been built upon. We're going to build a whole new city and we're going to change the art form. This is my Akhenaten. We're going to change the art form. We're going to look like weird, I dare I say aliens. They look like aliens, but they do. And it's just a time where I really just admire Akhenaten because he did what he wanted to do. He was just like, I'm not going to follow the way that my entire ancestors do. I'm just going to do whatever I want. And I kind of admire him for that. He is also Tutankhamun's father. So uh, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of the art form follows, even though they completely essentially banned. That's why we never knew about Tut for so long because his dad was such a heretic and they kind of cut him out of history along with Tutankhamun. And so that those two are the gateway drug that has brought me into Egypt, and I really have stuck close to it. That's what we've been focusing our discussion streams about for the last like couple weeks because there's
Oh,
so much to talk about with the Amarna period. I think I think Saturday we're going to talk about tombs in Amarna, but there we've been doing a lot of different discussion about the art form, about texts and stuff. It's like always a good question.
no, that's fantastic. And just kind of a heads up if you guys want to catch more than of these in-depth topics, because I have we're stream together for the first time, of course, but also Melissa and
Yes.
Denial's username. If you highlight over, not only will you get to follow Twitch, you'll also get to follow all the other social media. Say you post on TikTok and things like that.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
it's mainly between TikTok and Twitch, and then I have a Patreon as well where I'm working on doing more for that. But yeah, I already heard a couple people follow because my OBS is up and the Indiana Jones theme song came on really loud in my headphones so that I had to mute it earlier in the stream.
I have I'm skipping a few people's questions because there's a few people who are getting an opportunity to ask many. I just want to cover that everyone gets an opportunity, basically. Phantom asks, what social classes exist in ancient Egypt? And did they have a strong trade
Mm.
relation with other colonies or people? Mainly interested how these two kinds of
Yeah.
relations change through different eras, if you know.
Yeah, there is a pretty steep social difference, and this is a very unfortunate thing is, and this is honestly comes with a lot of archaeology. We know so little about the lowest of classes of Egyptians, because they did not have physical artifacts that were either preserved, they did not have good tombs. The vast majority of things that we talk about as ancient Egyptian, you are talking about the highest of high classes, the pharaohs, the officials, the people who work directly with the pharaohs. Very rarely are you looking at anything middle class or lower class, but there were artisans, there were artists, there were tons of different classes throughout ancient Egyptian history. Um, and in certain eras, Pharaoh's power became quite weak, mainly during those things that we call the intermediate periods. So in general, even those periods, we have very little artifacts from pharaohs themselves, because they were weak, and often there were pharaohs ruling at two different places in Egypt at the same time. And the Egyptians had very good trade relations with a lot of different people, with the exception that the Egyptians were, dare I say, racist. They probably were. Very prejudicial, we'll say. Very prejudicial about anyone other than themselves. Uh,
Okay.
they thought they were, which, when you look at other ancient cultures, most ancient cultures think this because they don't have as much interaction with other cultures. But the Egyptians thought they were the center of the universe, and that they were order, and everything outside the world, including the animal world, was chaos. And those two needed to be together, kind of, to really see everything. And so they had a lot of really good trade relations, with people in southern Africa, with people in the Near East. One of their favorite stones was lapis lazuli, and that only could be found in Afghanistan, really
Okay.
far away. And so they were trading pretty heavily. There's an area called Punt, which is most likely in the area of Somalia, though however many people try to tell me that Somalians know, Egyptologists, we don't have an exact location for
Mm.
it, but was a big trade hub as well. Um, Trade tends to be better closer to the New Kingdom. Uh,
Okay.
the Old Kingdom, the Old Kingdom definitely had stuff, but you kind of find that more than often than not, trade is much better in the New Kingdom. Granted, in the New Kingdom, they were, especially closer to the Ramesside period, they're invading more, and they're putting up like smaller colonies other places. Um, but like large any sort of large piece of wood you needed to get from Lebanon, Cyprus from Lebanon, because the
Oh.
Egyptians don't have good wood. They have very tiny little palm trees. And so often than not, a pharaoh would get a coffin that is made out of one solid piece of wood from Lebanon,
Mm.
but anyone lower than the pharaoh would have to piece together a coffin out of multiple pieces of wood, and then plaster it
Mm.
and paint it to look like one big piece of wood.
Okay. But they did bury all their dead in coffins.
It depends, but yes,
Oh.
mostly
Wow.
definitely the highest classes would get multiple coffins. The lowest class probably could not afford one, and so they would probably just do a typical pit burial. And then in certain time periods, like in the pre-dynastic age, everyone had a pit burial, pretty much.
Mm.
So it's back and forth with the words coffin and sarcophagus. Coffins, at least the way that I have typically said it, is coffins are big square, like they
Yeah.
look like a modern day coffin, and a sarcophagus is usually an anthropomoid, which means it looks like a human and it has the face,
Mm.
and that's more typical. And so you will hear me go back and forth on them because I don't know if there is a specific definition between the two of them, but some would have both. Some would have a square coffin that would have, or a stone square coffin with then wooden sarcophagi inside of it
Mm.
as well.
Okay. That was you're explaining so much. I hope you're getting a moment's
I
break
know.
here.
I know. Yeah, I know. I'm not chugging
there,
this water,
there's
Lily.
so many questions coming in, and I am going to be skipping anything about Goa'uld and Stargate. Is getting you're just not a priority, okay? Yeah.
I definitely can do one about like general pop culture, how Egypt is portrayed in pop culture, but yes, I
Mm.
can't get that deep into Stargate
Yeah,
or
no,
anything like that.
we
But
won't spend too much time on that. Maybe slightly off topic. Zir is asking: are
mm,
there commonalities with the Egyptian periods with other civilizations like the
mm.
Mayans? So this might lead to conspiracy theory as well. But is there any possibility, any
the
discussions?
the time period does not line up. Not at all. Pyramids were built vast, huge, thousands of years before some of the pyramids that are in either the Mayans or the Olmecs or the uh, not Incas. Incas didn't build pyramids. Aztecs, that's the other one. The only similarities that are really there is that the easiest way to build a tall structure is by building a pyramid, because it's going to be the most stable version of building something very, very tall.
Mm.
Uh, there anything beyond that, unfortunately, is very much conspiracy theorists, because it's just like, oh, there's the pyramids here, here in like Mexico, and then here in Egypt, and then here in Thailand, and I'm like, the timelines don't line up. uh, Pyramids took so long to build in Egypt that essentially, after the old kingdom, they did build some in the middle kingdom, but they were so shoddily made that they have collapsed, and they were so much smaller in general because they saw how long it took to build the bigger pyramids.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, pharaohs were like, well, there's no point of us building giant pyramids because, again, they're still combating tomb looters. And so they're like, well, let's just build our tombs in this like hidden valley up in the back so that nobody can find us, and then we'll build a big mortuary temple somewhere far away that people can like then worship us, but they don't need to come to our actual tomb. um but again, everyone who's looting is somebody who built it themselves.
You highlighted there was a bit of follow up actually earlier, and I might have skipped over it, but that you said that
Mhm.
the who built it would loot it themselves. Wasn't that contradictory to their religious faith, to loot those
in
temples?
in some ways, yes. For sure, that the the entire concept of why somebody is mummified for the Egyptians is because the they believe that the afterlife is exactly like real life, but in a land with the gods. And so you needed everything that you needed for living. So you needed a body, you needed to be able to breathe, you needed to be able to eat, you needed things to eat, you needed things to sleep on, you needed things to do your work. So all of those things had to be buried with you, and that's why your body had to be mummified. So
Okay.
yes, it is very contradictory, but it's not the most popular theory because it hasn't really been delved into very deeply, but there is a semi-popular theory that most of the Egyptians may have been more secular than we really thought, and that
Oh.
most of them were probably only worshiping household gods, which are gods that are just gonna that they believe are gonna help protect them in life, like gods that protect women, childbirth, children, and that doing like taking all of those things and then melting it down so that they could survive is not that big of a deal to them, because you're right, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they would do that and that they would disrespect their king and
Yeah.
their gods and such. But it also could just be people are desperate and people need money, and there are every day there are people that won't follow the religion and they won't care and
Yeah.
they'll do that. I hate to say it, there are looters that do that now, that in so many parts around the world there are looters that do not care that archaeologists will protect these things, and archaeologists will excavate them properly and won't damage them, and then they will help educate people. There are people that will just do that anyway. So it's it's a kind of back and forth, but there are, and the more I think about it, the more I look into it, is that I think the lowest of classes really were not, they were happy when, hey, there's a god, it's a god's birthday, it's a god's like celebration day, we're going to get some extra food, we'll go to the ceremonies, we'll do that. But then when they go back home, they're just living, they're
Mm.
just doing what they can, because otherwise it would be so horrible as like a very, very poor person to watch what the highest class think that they need to live in the afterlife, and the poorest people are like, I can afford one pot, that's what I can give to me. My family can't even give me food in the
Mm.
afterlife because they're struggling. And that's just like a horrible existence. And so I feel like they must have just, understood it. Vast majority like couldn't read or write. So the
Mm.
other thing is the only way that they're hearing about them is literally just through hearing.
Mm.
So it's a harder, it's a very hard topic to kind of talk about, because we don't have the evidence from the lowest of classes, and we don't have somebody who's sitting there writing, I don't believe in these gods, on like this piece of papyrus. Like, we don't have that.
Yeah,
So
no, that makes sense. Again, skipping questions if I've seen people ask, because I've tried to give priority to people who haven't has asked. We've gotten too many. Commander Herder asks, Tut's grave, Tutankhamun, I'm guessing, short, was
yep,
found to be full of treasure and, of course, golden death mask. Yet he died
yes.
young and followed an unpopular pharaoh. Can we
Hmm.
assume that the grades of other longer reigning and more popular pharaohs dwarfed Tutankhamun's treasure?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, yeah, he definitely had a lot of stuff, like over 5,000 artifacts. It's like somewhere 5,400 or something. Um, a lot of them were possibly taken from other people's like grave goods. And actually, now that I'm saying this, 5,400 is what Howard Carter found. It had already been looted twice before. So there's an estimated 60% of his jewelry is actually missing, which is saying something because he already had a lot of jewelry.
Okay.
Um, but his tomb had actually been looted twice before. It is technically not, some people will say it is the only uh unlooted or fully preserved pharaonic tomb, and that is not true. It had been looted twice. There is only one pharaonic tomb, which one is that is very rarely talked about. But those are the kings of Tanis. And but yes, it is definitely possible that these tombs had a crazy amount of stuff in them.
Wow.
Um, Mostly because Tut's tomb is actually so small, it does not follow the standard practice of how tombs were built in the Valley of the Kings, probably because it was either made for somebody else who wasn't a pharaoh. One of the big theories is that it was made for Ai, who was a who became the pharaoh after Tut, but at the time was just a vizier,
Okay.
or that he died so suddenly that they're like, well, we got to stop building the tomb now. This is what we got. Um, and so uh yes, there probably was countless and countless more things, if not around the same amount of tuts. Because yeah, because if you look at how big the Valley of the King's tombs are, they're crazy.
Mm.
It makes me so sad because we looking at Tut's tomb tells so much about his life. Like it gives very, very minute little details. We have his shoes. We know exactly how big his feet would be. Like we get these very tiny details. One of my favorite pieces is there's a small piece of hair in a box, and there's a writing on it, and it is actually a piece of his grandmother, Queen Ta's hair. It's a lock of her
Oh.
hair, and it's like, and to me that is like, and Ta, I'm trying to think if she was, I don't think she was alive when he died. I think she had died a couple years before, or we're not sure. But like something like that, that is so sentimental, that is so like, I want to be connected to my grandson. Like that is so different, and so it saddens me so much because while I think we do know a lot about all these pharaohs, we probably don't know the half of it
Yeah.
because of the things that have been lost from those tombs.
Mm. Oh, that's actually
Very good
I
question.
really like
Very, very
the
good
hair.
question.
Yes, that was really good.
The
Good
hair is
job,
so
Howard.
cool. It's one of my favorite pieces.
40 Maker asks, from what I read the question, it doesn't seem controversial, but
Go for
warns
it.
that the question sounds blunt. I don't think it is. What role did the visor play in maintaining social order, and
Oh,
how did this position evolve across different dynasties? That was the question.
that's a very good question. I In certain time periods, the pharaoh's power became particularly weak. And in more cases than not, it was more likely that the priesthood actually was becoming much more powerful. And essentially, they owned more land and thus were getting more. You remember, there's no coinage in ancient Egypt. There's no actual money. It's all a barter system.
Oh, it
Um,
was it? Thanks for letting me
yeah,
know.
no coins entered Egypt until I believe the Assyrians invaded in the very, very end of the late period, and then when the Greco-Romans come in. So there was no coinage, there was nothing like that. It was all
Mm,
barter system. You were paid by your food. So like you would be paid by, usually it was just grain because then you could make it into bread and beer, which are the
mm.
two standard food things that
So
everybody would
whatever
eat no matter
artwork
what.
or whatever thing, whatever skill you had, that was your bread and butter.
That was your bread and butter,
Mm,
exactly. And so the vizier itself, in some cases seems to have been a particularly powerful position, but in a lot of cases not, because what you see is there is a trend, and this is because Egypt history is so long. You can see history repeating itself very often, where at the very end of one of our kingdoms, old, middle, and new, the pharaoh's power is kind of dwindling and the priesthood is getting very much higher. And then essentially something happens that then breaks that up. And that's what sort of leads to the intermediate periods very often. And so the vizier, we don't have as many viziers like preserved, like we don't have as many. The only way you would really know about them, unfortunately, is if you found their tomb and that is one of their titles written
Okay.
in the tomb. And so there are a couple of them. I I for example, it's literally spelled AY, is a very interesting aspect because there's a potential that he is actually Nefertiti's father, who was the wife of Akhenaten, not the mother of Tutankhamun, but stepmother, but great royal wife of Akhenaten. Um, and he was apparently probably also a vizier during the reign of Amenhotep IV, who is Akhenaten, and maybe even Amenhotep III. Like he was a really old guy when he took the throne after Tut died. And there were weird theories that he had killed Tut so that he could have the throne and such. And he is actually depicted. It's the only time, minus a son and father, it's the only time the next pharaoh is depicted in a previous pharaoh's tomb. Because I was the vizier, and thus he is depicted actually in Tutankhamun's tomb. So,
Mm.
yeah, the vizier it's a hard position to kind of find, and I don't know
Mm.
if Egypt's always had them.
Mm.
Um, they don't seem to be like a prime minister. It's more probably an advisor or something.
Okay.
Probably the highest of advisors.
Yeah, but not enough evidence to make conclusive statements, basically.
No, not much.
Expedus asks why a certain rite of passage which indicated the start of an adulthood for a boy is specifically associated with the
Oh.
god Horus. Also, which gods from other pantheons are
Hmm.
most similar with Horus and may be described as its counterpart? That's a loaded question.
So the first question, I don't know much. I don't think we have really a sort of rite of passage for a young boy. I have not really heard of that or realized that. Minus a unless it's considering the pharaoh. The pharaoh is associated with Horus because Horus is the son of Osiris and the king of the gods. And in a lot of cases, the pharaoh is supposed to be a reincarnation of Horus himself. He is supposed to be a
Oh.
son of the god. So in that case, yes, like Horus is very much associated with that, but it's only the pharaoh. It's only that kingship. It's not meant to be anyone else. The second question, to be honest, I really hate comparing pantheons of gods from different cultures unless they actually did interact with each other. Because yes, so like the Roman and the Greek ones, yes, there are counterparts to each of those because they are very much based on each other. um but Egypt is its own thing, and people get really annoyed whenever I say that, like I'll say Sekhmet is the goddess of, like somebody's like, "Oh, isn't Sekhmet the goddess of war?" And I'm like, "She's the goddess of a bajillion other things." And so they were like, "Oh, but if she's the goddess of war, then she is Ares." And I'm like, "But that's not what she is." Because these gods existed for thousands of years, they are not just one thing.
Mm.
Like they are not usually, they are multiple different things, and so I really don't like making comparisons to it.
Mm.
But Horus in itself, Horus is the son of Osiris. He is, in a way, a savior. He is the one who, in later Egyptian mythology, who defeats the evil god Set. Which also calling Set an evil god is also not good. So I retract that portion of it. Because again, like you put those two people always together, and I've really been converted. There's a Kemeticist, which, if you don't know what that is a person who worships the ancient Egyptian religion in real life now.
Oh.
And so she's on Twitch here. Her name is Desert Rose Goddess. I have 2 lectures with her over on my YouTube page, and her god that she worships is Set. And so she did an entire lecture, which was amazing, about how Set is worshipped all throughout ancient Egyptian history and how it changes. And then also how he is viewed in popular culture as this villain god when that is not really what he is at all. Yes, he is the god of chaos, but the Egyptians accept that order and chaos need to both exist at the same
Oh,
time. They
they
can't
were on
not.
top of the laws of thermodynamics. Let's go.
Yes.
Let's go.
So yeah, I don't like comparing Horus to anything like that, but he is like he is like the savior. He is supposed to be like the pharaoh. He is technically the king of the gods because Osiris is living in the
Mm,
afterlife. But it's kind of he's kind of the head of most of the pantheons.
mm.
That's the best way I can describe it. But I would not compare him to Zeus. He is not Zeus. Nowhere. No one can compare to Zeus. Very good
Leonardo
question though.
Leonardo
Very good
asks,
question.
did the top of pyramids have a different material finish? I think I remember vaguely in some mummy movie
Yes.
there was a talk that there was a diamond top.
Not a diamond,
It
but
was a
yes.
diamond, it
I
was a
mean, in
gem or
some.
something.
Yeah. So the top of a pyramid is called a pyramidion. And a pyramidion is usually one solid stone because it's usually I say small. It's probably the size of like a dishwasher, maybe even bigger than that. Like I was trying to think of something that's that size.
Yeah.
It's fairly large. In some cases they were a different stone. There is actually a pyramidion at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and I feel like it's Amenemhet the third or something, and it's a beautiful green stone, which is not what the pyramid is made out of. But I believe we do suspect that the pyramids of Giza, their pyramidions were gilded with gold, but probably not solid gold,
Yeah.
but gilded with gold.
Hey.
And as it is, the pyramids themselves are missing their outer layer that would have made them really white and really shiny. Only when you look at the three pyramids, the middle one, the second tallest one, the pyramid of Khafre, has a little bit of that outer casing stone, which is made out of no, it's not tufa. I always say it's tufa is in Italy. Tura limestone. Tura
Okay.
limestone. It's white, really shiny, and would have been really smooth. Nowadays, you can, even though you're not allowed to, you can walk up the pyramid with the steps. It would have been completely smooth on any side. But all of those pieces have been taken off and reused other places or just fallen off.
Oh, I feel like I have heard of this. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can only see it at the very top of the middle pyramid. Actually, my little Lego pyramid shows what it would have looked like. It's got those smooth, very white, very polished, very shiny stones. And the only parts that are still preserved are some at the very bottoms of some of the pyramids, and then at the very top of Khafre's pyramid is still preserved.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for answering. Salvage looted material for building. Roy Batty asks, was there anything discovered when they moved Earth and Abu Simbay?
Mm-hmm.
Simbay? I don't see the
Abu
last.
Simbel.
Sembel. Okay, sorry, I don't see the rest of the
Yeah.
question. It's on the side. Sorry, when they moved Earth and Abu Simbel complex and prepared the area where the current Aswan High Dam is located. I hope I pronounced that okay.
Yeah. That is super interesting. I don't know. So if, I'll give the example for those who don't know what this is.
Yeah.
In the very south of modern day Egypt and the south of like the Egyptian Empire, there along the Nile, they modern Egyptians have put a couple different dams to try to stop the natural flooding of the Nile that happens every single
Yes.
year, which was completely and utterly needed by the ancient Egyptians, but like nowadays in modern day we're not that adaptable, unfortunately. And so they put a couple small dams, and then in the 70s they put the Aswan High Dam. And the Aswan High Dam was essentially so tall that everything south of the Aswan High Dam was going to flood into what is now Lake Nasser. And so they did UNESCO, which is, oh, I always trip up what UNESCO is, but it is the Educational and Science Fund along with the UN. Um, they ran this huge campaign where tons of different museums and countries all over the world came together to try to both record and in some cases salvage different archaeological sites as well as actual Nubian villages that were essentially in the path of this giant lake that was going to form. Abu Simbel is one of those. Abu Simbel is a massive two temple complex made by Ramses the Great during the New Kingdom. And if you ever see it, it is the typical, it's these four big statues of Ramses with a tiny little door in the middle. And then there's a second temple that no one ever looks at, but that's for his wife Nefertari.
Oh.
Um, and what they did was that they chopped up all of the pieces and then brought it up like I don't even know how high, but they essentially found another flat place very high in this valley and rebuilt the entire thing in the essentially exact same location and exact same positioning and built a fake mountain behind it. And they did this with a couple other temples. There's a couple temples in some museums. There's one in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art um, that were removed from that place, and then anything that could not be removed was recorded as best as it could be at that time, and then it is still now flooded essentially. I don't know if, well, we'll say this. I absolutely know that they had to have excavated or had to have done some sort of excavation on the second location for Abu Simbel because that is the standard of archaeology around the world. Anytime you are building something else, an archaeologist usually has to go and look at it and make sure that they are not uncovering any sort of archaeological material so that they can try to preserve it. And so I
Mm.
know that they had to have done something. It's the same thing. I actually answered this question recently about the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo that they have just almost opened fully after 20 years of building it. But the standard of these countries, it's typically in Europe, in the Americas, and places like Egypt. Unfortunately, a lot of other places don't have these laws that kind of protect stuff like this. But I know that they would have had to excavate. I don't know if they found anything. That is a very good question that I would have to look into. I don't suspect they did because the area around here is around where Abu Simbel is very dry. There is not it's very rocky and dry and there's not even good cultivation. There's not even places where you can grow crops. So probably people did not typically live down there. Um but that is a very good question. I don't know if they found anything specifically where they had to like rebuild this new
Mm.
mountain for this temple.
Okay.
I kind of just highly doubt it just because I know down in that area there aren't a lot of major cities besides Aswan, which is kind of at the very end before the Nile gets really cavernous, like a lot like the Grand Canyon. It becomes the sides become very tall, like along the river, and
Mm.
wasn't really easy. They're called the cataracts, where essentially it becomes immovable for large boats to be able to like go through the Nile anymore.
Mm.
And you would the Egyptians, when literally where they were going down there, they'd have to pick up and carry their boat around to then get around the cataract. And so people didn't live typically down there as much. There's not as many archaeological sites until you get to Sudan,
Mm.
and you get down to what is considered Nubia. Good question. Good
Thank you so
question.
much for answering. So I have caught up with everyone giving their first question. So I there was a lot of questions, but there was repeat from people, and I had to prioritize. Um, there is a question just to repeat. I'll ask from Whisper asking, could you tell us more about? Oh, okay, I'm going to try and pronounce it. Hat Hatshepsut. Hat
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut. Do you
Yeah,
know a lot about her?
I do. I do know a lot about Hatshepsut. And this is such a it doesn't I don't want it to be a controversial, but unfortunately it tends to be pretty controversial
Oh,
because Hatshepsut is one of the only female pharaohs that we know of.
oh,
And she's not the first, she's not nearly the first. But there are a couple, and she is definitely the most prominent, and we have the most evidence of her.
mm,
Um she is in the New Kingdom. She's a couple dynasties, or actually she's still in the 18th dynasty with Tutankhamun, but she's just a couple pharaohs ahead of them. And she has a very very interesting life story, and a lot of people misinterpret her. Mainly what happens is that she is the daughter of the previous pharaoh, and
mm-hmm.
this is where it gets difficult because they're all named the exact same thing. So Tutmosis the first is her father, and she marries her brother, which, spoiler alert, if you didn't know this about the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs married their siblings. Nobody else did, just the pharaohs. It's a way of keeping the bloodline strong. It didn't happen all the time, but it did happen. It's just the thing you got to know, but
Noted,
it's
noted.
not everyone. It's not everyone. It's just the pharaohs. Um, she marries her brother, who I believe is Tutmos II. She only has a daughter with Tutmos II, and pharaohs had typically multiple wives. So another one of Tutmos II's wives has a son named Tutmos III. And then her father dies, and then her husband dies. And Tutmosis III is a little baby. He's like probably under 10 years old. Probably even under 5. He might even be that younger. So Hatshepsut steps in as a
Acting
regent,
pharaoh. Oh, okay.
essentially. That's the thing. It starts as a regent, and then
Oh,
it slowly becomes she becomes essentially an acting pharaoh. And you can see, depending on what time within her reign, you can see the differences of how she is portraying herself and how she wants to be seen by the Egyptian public. At the beginning, she is depicted as a woman, and she is depicted with a Nemes headdress, which is the kind of royal headdress. And then a little bit later into it, she starts suddenly becoming this more, in the images, more androgynous. You don't really see, she has this beautiful like smile, and like you can tell in her eyes instantly that it's her, but that sort of goes away and you're like, wait a second, she's kind of looking more male, but she's still being depicted in like a dress. And then later she is depicted as a full man, shirtless, with like the biceps, with a royal beard and all this stuff. Yeah,
okay.
very strong, very, again, like changes the body type immediately. People have thus said that she is transgender, or she identified as a man, and that is not, like, there are some arguments for that, but you have to also think that uh we don't know what their concept of LGBTQ plus was. We
Yes.
have no idea. We have no writings. We have no concept of, like, that was not a thing. It's hard to believe, but like that mindset was not a thing. We don't know what their mindset was. The more than likely is that she saw that maybe she wasn't being taken seriously enough, and that she was like, well, I have to portray myself like a pharaoh. I have to portray myself like my father did, like my husband did. I have to portray myself like this. And so she, there's a lot of other fun stuff that she does. I when I got to visit her mortuary temple, which is this massive, massive temple in Luxor, uh, there's an amazing depiction of her mother pregnant on the tomb walls, which is like literally never done. You never see a depiction of a pregnant woman in Egypt. And she she is depicted like this because Hatshepsut tells a story that the god Amun, who later he kind of becomes the head of the pantheon in Luxor, that the god Amun came and visited her mother, and so she is actually not Tutmosis the first daughter, but is a divine daughter, and that essentially trying to again solidify her throne and to say, I am the rightful owner of
Mm.
this. And so her reign was actually pretty long. The unfortunate thing is that after she passes away, Tutmos III, who they were sort of supposed to be dual rulers, but you can tell that she controlled like so much more. Tutmosis III and whatever probably advisors he had with him, who were probably really not happy with Hatshepsut, wiped her name from existence, or tried to.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, and so her depictions are carved out, her name is carved out, and everything is kind of replaced with Tutmosis the third, and it's really like he doesn't want anyone to know about her.
But
And so
how do
that's,
we know about her?
we have enough. They didn't get everything, and the actually surprising part is that her mortuary temple is really well preserved because it had eventually been covered up with sand and soil, and a monastery was
Oh.
actually built on top of it. And so nobody touched it for a little bit, and then it was discovered in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But yeah, she's a super interesting. I really encourage everyone to like look deeper into her because there's so many different theories about her. And I'm just more on the art historical side. That's where I've been taught. I haven't gone deeper into that and such. Hello, Raiders. Welcome.
Yes, I was just going to highlight that. Hello, Raiders. Sorry, we're just in the middle of a podcast where I have a wonderful guest, MelissainDeNile. We are doing a talk. Melissa is a Egyptologist, and we're just asking a bunch of questions. It has been flooded, so if you guys are interested in hearing a little bit, you're more than welcome to hang out. I apologize we don't give the whole hype shebang. We because we try to focus on the podcast aspect of it and to keep it in theme. But that was actually such a lovely story that you said. I've never heard of her before, and giving the
She's
insight
great.
that you did is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Medjay, I don't know if you can recognize the name Medjay.
I noticed it when I came in
Um,
the other day. I was like,
he's a wonderful
oh.
mod, but he's also an artist, as you might guess
Ah,
from where. And he does all my
yes.
emotes and all my artwork. So everything you see is all created by Medjay.
I
And
noticed
he
that.
asks, what was your favorite Egyptian food while you visited Egypt?
Oh my god, I ate so much there. Like, so very funny enough, there's an Egyptian restaurant where I live here, and a couple days before I went with my father as half half work trip and half just vacation, because he was like, I need to get out of the country and do something,
Mm,
and he was like, where. He's like, "What are we gonna eat there?" He kind of panicked a little bit.
mm.
He's like, I don't know what this is." I'm like, "Let's go to this Egyptian restaurant. Let's get all this." I love koshery. Hysterically, did not have any koshery when I was in Egypt. I don't know. I don't know where. It was not on any of the menus of the places that I went to. But I do love koshery, which is a really great like street food with like lentils and pasta and grilled onions. Oh my god, it's like so good. Um, I ate a lot of like grilled chicken, and I had really good. And I'm blanking on the name of it. Um, oh god, it's an eggplant dish,
Oh,
and typically I've heard of it not in the context of Egypt and other oh my god, I'm gonna blank on it forever, but um it was very very good. It was We didn't go with the tour group, which was a very like I need to make a video about it, but it's like how like why I went didn't go with the tour group and why you probably should. And so there was a lot of stuff that we probably didn't have access to like better restaurants and stuff. But no, me and my dad had a lot of fun. He loved a lot of like meat kebabs. We were eating so much good food.
street food must have been
Um
really good, right?
yeah, it
I'm a
was
big fan
very
of
good.
street food. Oh,
Um yeah, it was really really good. And our hotel, when we stayed in Giza rather than staying in Cairo, and our hotel was immediately next to the Sphinx, and so it had a triple rooftop deck that you could eat all your food while literally just like looking at the baba ganoush. Thank you. It was baba ganoush, and then it was no, but there's another one that's like in a tomato. It's like a stew, and but
oh,
I had baba ganoush and really good bread, and yeah, lots of grilled veggies and grilled stuff. It was so good.
nice.
It wasn't Masaa. No, it wasn't that one. Get good. It's one that is typically I usually associate with more with Greek food than with Egyptian food, but I did have it there,
Mm.
and it was definitely different, but it was really really good. It wasn't that one, I don't think. Um,
Shakshuka.
uh, Not shakshuka. I've had shakshuka before, but not shakshuka. Shakshuka is an egg dish. I'm blank. I literally cannot think of the stupid
All
food
right,
that I
no
ate.
worries, no worries. But it was
But
delicious. The summary is
it's
it's
gonna
really
come to
good.
me like 20 minutes after we leave. Yeah.
This might be like a sensitive question. If you don't want to answer, please always be
That's fine.
bold to me and say, "Look, I'm not comfortable." Hollywood. So double triple asks.
Mm,
Hollywood usually uses white actors to portray
yeah.
ancient Egyptians. What ethnicity were they? Have any evidence of anything?
This is a very difficult question,
Okay.
and it is something that again kind of stems on what I just sort of said, is
Yes.
that
Mm.
the concept of an ethnicity or the concept of a race was not around at the time of the ancient Egyptians. So whenever this question comes up, I say they were Egyptian because
Mm.
that's what they were. And that's how they saw themselves. The concept of a continent, the concept of Africa, those are not things that are coming about. If you're asking specifically what was the color of their skin, it's a range. They're coming from this area where they're going to have darker skin. We know that. But it's you cannot say they are black, you cannot say they are white. Like that's those concepts are not around.
Mm.
Yes, were the Egyptians very prejudicial for everybody except them? They were, but it had nothing to do with the color of anybody's skin. It had nothing to do with it had to do with where people were from physically.
Mm.
Like, and so it's
I
they
was
were
gonna
people.
say they
Yeah,
didn't know any better,
it's
but
so
that's
hard.
the opposite really of what I want to say. As in, they didn't know
It's
so many
they did
outside
know,
races.
and
Yeah.
granted, a lot of that has to do with like the highest of class of people, and that's just how that has been portrayed. I'm sure the lowest of class people did not even know anything about this. Like, um, so it's there is a very interesting concept when it comes to how modern people have viewed ancient Egyptians, and is very much stemmed in, unfortunately, the much later transatlantic slave trade, and that a lot of, and isn't always, but a lot of African Americans in particular, because they do not know where they come from, because they were at some point part of the transatlantic slave trade, so they do not know what country, what group comes from. They and this is a part of the more larger Afrocentric movement of trying to learn more about those cultures. A lot of them have said that we're from Egypt. And a lot of that comes from Egypt is the only African nation that is ever talked about in history, at least in popular history.
Popular, yeah.
You're not going to learn about the really cool, amazing, like ancient cultures of Timbuktu or Somalia or like West Africa. You're not going to learn about those because those are not talked about because of racism. It's just all stems back to racism. But like all of those things is that they're like, well, this is an amazing culture. This is a culture that is lifted up. This is a culture that is talked about in popular media. So why couldn't we be from there?
Mm.
And so that is where, as someone says, modern people versus Netflix. That Netflix documentary, which if anybody doesn't know it, it's actually part of a full series. I think
Oh,
it has been canceled since then. I have no idea, but it was
okay.
called Queens of Egypt, or Queens of Africa.
Yes,
It's like
yes,
called
I've heard
Queens of
of it.
Africa.
Yeah.
Like two before the one that came out about Egypt, there was a previous season that was about some really cool African queens, and nobody really picked up on it. I had never heard of this documentary. Like nobody, it's produced by Jada Pickett Smith. Like it did not have that traction that probably I'm
Yeah.
sure that they really wanted to. So then they come to one about Egypt, and they are not just saying that Egyptians were black. They are only saying that Cleopatra is black, which is that is inherently wrong. I accept that there are people who are going to say like ancient Egyptians were black because I think there's a very high possibility that some of them were. But what are you talking about? Are you talking about the skin color? Are you talking about honestly an ethnicity?
Mm.
Are you talking about how you identify? That's a different thing. People don't think it is, but it is. It's a different thing. Um, and the thing with Cleopatra is Cleopatra is Greek. She's Macedonian. She, yes, had her people lived there for about 500 years and probably maybe have integrated with some of the native Egyptians. Yes. But we do actually know, like, the Ptolemies, even though they were Greek, they followed the Egyptian tradition of marrying their siblings. So we actually probably know that it was probably a pretty pure bloodline of Macedonian Greeks.
Mm.
And so the way that they came out about it is that like I understand that if they had picked Hatshepsut, I would have been like, okay, yeah. I would have been like, that's fine. Um, but because they picked Cleopatra, I don't know if they did it to be clickbaity. They might have.
Oh, you think that it was
Um,
purposely designed to
I,
get?
because it doesn't make any sense because I hate to say it, most people know she is the least likely queen to have been that. And so I wonder, and I hate to say it, one of the Egyptologists that was in the documentary, which I never got to watch because I didn't want to throw a remote at my TV. The one of the Egyptologists is not the most respected in the field. So she has been controversial in a lot of different ways. And when I saw her face in the trailer, I said, oh, they couldn't get anybody else. They literally could not get any other Egyptologist because none of them would have put their name on it except this woman. And I
Okay.
was like, that as soon as I saw that made so much more sense to me that I was like, well, that's where this is going to fall in kind of the really bad to decently good like documentaries, because my
Mm.
god, I was like, oh, that makes so much more sense to me.
It's so interesting
But
to
yeah,
say
it's such a
that.
difficult question,
Yeah,
and
it
I
is
and I
difficult. Thank you for being like
it's
bold was was the word I
yeah,
was gonna say. But it's so nice to like to touch on these topics, talk about them, to be open about them. I think
yeah,
talking about everything and anything
Mhm.
And thank you so much for speaking about that.
Yeah, you're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it. I will go on to talk a little bit because we are approaching the end. I have a job to go to tomorrow. So I will say I have two questions. One
Yes.
is do you have any books or games recommendations that have quite good Egyptian lore?
So many.
Okay.
Well, good is relative, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fun games. Um Assassin's Creed Origins is going to be my favorite game of all time. I will always give that the caveat of Assassin's Creed Origins is that it takes place in the Greek occupation of Egypt.
Okay.
So there's a lot of stuff that you see in that time period that is not technically true for the vast majority of Egyptian history, because the Greeks did bring a lot of their culture and their traditions to Egypt. And it's relatively accurate. There's a lot of things. The discovery tours are amazing, even though they aren't. They do talk about all Egyptian history. The discovery tours are great. Um, and there's just like a great way that you can go and explore. It does have its caveats. I'm really annoyed that it didn't do the normal. The Great Pyramid of Giza doesn't have its normal chambers. There's like a
Oh.
whole added separate part because it's part of the story, and I'm like, it's not like we totally don't have like a really great 3D model of this exact chamber. Like it's not like they just added stuff to add stuff.
Fair enough.
Um but it's a really great game. I really enjoyed it. We're actually probably gonna start and I want to replay it because that was the first game we played on stream 4 years ago.
Nice.
Uh but I'm not. My followers have told me I'm not allowed because I have to play all the other Assassin's Creed games. So I think for the stream anniversary, we're gonna open a new save file and go
Nice.
back to it for a little bit though. Um, and then there's just some other ones that are like kind of fun and kind of silly, and these are like kind of from the 90s and 2000s. There's a game called Ankh, and there's 1, 2, and 3, and Ankh is so weird and it's so campy. But it is really funny, and it is set in ancient Egypt, and it's very weird, but it's really fun. And you can get a lot of these on Steam. And one of the other ones I loved was Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy, which is again another very campy, very 90s video game where you play as I think you play as a guy named Horus, and then you also play as you actually play as Tutankhamun, but as a mummy. And there's a lot of inaccuracies in it, but
Fair enough.
they're both very fun. And then my other recommendation for a more general archaeology game is it's called C14 Dating, and it is a dating sim where you play as an archaeologist, an American archaeologist who is going to her field school in Belgium, and you can pick you can date other hot archaeologists.
I
But
think we need
my
to
con-
increase the rating of the stream subtly, very quickly. Mods.
the caveat to this, it is the best game that depicts how archaeology is done
Oh.
in an honestly upsetting way because it makes the certain parts of the game so boring.
And that's really what archaeology is like.
It's really what archaeology is like. Like it
Fair enough.
genuinely gives so much accurate detail on like how to excavate and how to like do stuff, and like the way that you talk with like the professors in the game is like so accurate and so funny. And But I will say it's also one of the hardest games I've ever played because I've played it. We usually play it around Valentine's Day. I
Of
have played it,
course.
I think, 3 times, and I have never gotten a boyfriend or a girlfriend. I believe there is one girl that you can date in it. I've never gotten one because it is so hard. So that's a side thing. You might have to literally like follow a guidebook
Guide
to it
to
because I've been wanting to play it again, but literally I have never. It's called
Oh,
C14 dating.
C14 dating. There we go.
Yeah, so
C14 dating.
it's literally
Carbon, yeah, carbon
carbon
14.
14.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like the best pun ever.
Yeah.
Um, but it's actually it tells you it's a Neolithic site about like cavemen, so it actually tells you the difference between like Neanderthal and Neanderthal, and like it gives
Mm.
so much information. But it honestly gets a little boring, so I skip some of the stuff when
Fair enough.
But you'd learn a lot.
I don't want to do my job on the plug.
No.
No.
Exactly.
Fair enough. And then
those are some of my favorite recommendations.
Thank you so much for your recommendation. Appreciate it. We might check out the C14 sometime. Maybe for Valentine's Day. And my last question for you is your username, MelissainDeNile. Do you have a story behind? Obviously, there's a pun in there about Nile River,
yes.
but is there anything more to it?
A little bit. So MelissainDeNile was originally a title of a blog that I started when I was in grad school. So before MelissainDeNile as a brand, as a educational content creator was existent, I started it as a blog to talk about the difficulties of grad school because I was having a lot of imposter syndrome, and I still have imposter syndrome to this day, and grad school has just pushed it further and further away. But it really was like a joke that like I am always in denial that I don't know everything, and I feel like that I cannot be the best educator that I can because I also have like a learning disability that affects my memory, and so certain things like the name of a very famous dish that I ate will leave my brain and it'll come back like 20 minutes later because I just those words and sometimes those images are really hard for me to pull back up. And so it's very much based on that. And if I remember correctly, which I'm not even 100% sure, I believe my therapist that I had in grad school gave me the name of it. And or gave me something about it. And then essentially when I decided in 2020, I graduated in the pandemic for my master's, and I still had to take 2 more classes, but like the next semester from home. And I had essentially 6 months where there was no point of trying to get a job if I had to say, hey, sorry, I got to take these 2 other classes. And when I decided to start MelissainDeNile, I was like, there's no other better name. I really tried to think of a different name.
No, it really is so good.
I really tried to think of one, and I was just like, and so I essentially disabled the whole old blog and started it originally as a blog. And then now it is expanded into Twitch and Patreon and TikTok and other things.
All the good stuff.
So,
yes.
All the good stuff.
No, that is a fantastic name. We are approaching that. This is a 2-hour max segment. Jesus, we rarely get this. We really do need to finish. Orf, you asked so many questions, and too many of them were meme questions. So Orf, you're getting the bold box next week. But what I want to say is, do you have any last statements or any last proclamations before we finish up?
Oh God, I love that. It's not even like a shout out. It's like I could say anything. Don't
do drugs.
Don't do drugs, kids. This is like something I try my best to stop miscommunication of. They're memes. They're not Egypt history facts. They're memes and things. Don't loot graves. Yes, that's a very good one.
That's a good
don't
one.
Loot things.
Yeah.
Let the archaeologists do what they are meant to do. But my big thing is that I have a whole series of videos on TikTok about this. Don't believe the statement the Victorians ate mummies, because it's not true, and it annoys the crap out of me every time I see it passed on.
Is this another British media thing again?
It is another British media thing.
I knew it.
Well, the concept is that, and the very short of it, because it is there's a whole series of videos that you guys can watch. They did eat Egyptian mummies in some cases, not because they wanted to eat Egyptian mummies, but because they wanted to eat something called bitumen, which is natural asphalt. And the big misconception of this is that it's not the Victorians. By the time of the Victorians, they actually thought this was weird, which I know that any part of weird history, people usually attribute to the Victorians, which is why I understand why this meme has come about.
I see.
But it actually was done more in the medieval period and like after like the Crusades, because the Arabic had used it as medicine. And they brought it back. It's called Mummia. You can look it up on. It has a very detailed Wikipedia article.
Okay.
But it's mainly based on a miscommunication of mistranslation. So
not
don't believe that statement.
Not what I expected to when I tell people to make a last statement before stream.
You asked for a proclamation.
You know
what? That is a proclamation.
I did. I have no regrets.
I will be streaming tomorrow. We stream on TikTok. We stream usually we have a Tuesday game and a Thursday game, and then Saturdays or Sundays we do either guest lectures. We're kind of in our lull for guest lectures.
Mm.
We call it the Beyond Denial series. That will start back up closer to March because this season is so busy for me. And then, so what are we playing tomorrow? We are playing something called Risky Chronicles and the Curse of Destiny. It's like an old fashioned sort of Mario game of going in little tombs and temples. And then we're finishing up the OG Assassin's Creed on Thursdays, and we
Oh,
also have been playing a game called Pharaoh's Purse, which we are friends with the dev and the artist, and we'll be finishing that hopefully on Saturday, and then doing a discussion on Saturday. So,
fantastic.
and I post
Okay.
everything over on TikTok pretty often, almost
Yeah.
every day.
So if you highlight Melissa's name in the title, it'll actually give the link to all the social media stuff. So click which one you prefer if you're a TikToker,
Yes.
Instagrammer, whatever it
And
is.
all my old lectures are on YouTube. I'm going to, with the unfortunate potential of the American election system banning TikTok, I will be starting posting other places
Oh
as
yeah,
well. So
I heard.
follow me on
Yes.
Instagram or YouTube as well. But I'm going to start doing that soon because we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple months. And I make my living on TikTok, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, TikTok
Yeah.
it is. All
Yes.
right. Farewell, everyone. I'm going to go into the AFK screen and I will be guiding you into a random raid. Apologies on my half that I will not say hello to a raiding. I think I'm going to raid How to Be Quiet, and I'll see you guys on Friday. Very, very late. Next time you see me, I apologize. Reason being is work is crazy. So I'll see you on Friday. I'll keep you updated in Discord. No movie night this week, but say bye.
Bye, guys.